Hello, and welcome to my presentation today on transitional IEPs, what they are, and how we go about writing those. My name is Amy Fitzsimmons. I'm a student in Special Education Class 570 Collaboration, and it is June of 2024. So what is a transitional IEP? Well, we're going to get into that today, and by the end of this training, you should know what a transitional IEP is, know when and how to assess for transitional IEPs, know how transition goals are created, know how general education teachers play a role in a transitional IEP, know how other community providers or service providers play a role in a transition IEP, and understand why a student has a transition IEP. So what is a transition IEP? Well, a transition IEP will explore and set goals for the student around life after high school. The team will set goals around post-secondary life that will provide direction for the child's whole IEP. The domains in which the team will set goals are employment, post-secondary education, and independent living. The team must have goals that address employment and secondary education. Independent living goals are not necessary if a team makes this determination. In addition to creating goals around life after high school, the student, if not already, becomes more of a vital part of the team. Starting in the 9th grade, students must be invited to their IEP meetings. Employment goals will be explored, and they will look to see if the student will work in a paid position. Will they be unpaid? Will they enroll in the military? Will they work a traditional career? Will they need supported or sheltered employment? Post-secondary education doesn't just mean college, but what types of education or training will be needed for the student to obtain their desired employment? Is it a 4-year degree, a 2-year degree program? Is it trade school? Is it vocational or on-the-job training? Is it an adult day program? In independent living skills, they explore community participation, recreation and leisure, and home living. What skills might a student need to build in order to participate safely in their community? This could include daily living skills like cooking, budgeting, personal care, advocacy, transportation, and other skills as determined by the team. Once the team has determined these measurable goals, they can work up to set up IEP goals around meeting these. We will explore more as we move through the training. So as I mentioned before, they drive the goals for the student's IEP. So when and how do we assess students for their transition goals? Well, the IEP team must evaluate a special education student for transition by the 9th grade, and that's per Minnesota law. If a student is due for a re-evaluation or is receiving a first evaluation in 7th or 8th grade, teachers should also do a transition assessment. Now, when case managers send that prior written notice, they must include language that states that they are also assessing for transition needs. Now, I've included a brief example of that language here. You would want to make sure that you note that the district proposes to conduct an evaluation or a reevaluation to determine levels of educational performance, and here's that key word that's different from previous IEPs. It says, or PWNs, those prior written notices. It talks about including an evaluation of transitional needs. And then you must also include a statement that says, assessment data on transition must be a part of the evaluation process for students either entering into grade 9 or during their 9th grade year. And they must also list an assessment to be used under the evaluation and assessment portions of the IEP. So when you're creating your prior written notice, you'll have a drop-down space for you to write the area that's to be evaluated, what type of evaluation or assessment is going to be done, and who that evaluator is. Now in this example here, you'll see that we have listed transition as the area to be evaluated. And the evaluation and assessments that I'll be using are student interest planning inventories and interview, and then an informal parent interview. And the evaluator in this case is the special education teachers. Now, evaluators must use at least 2 different assessments that explore student strengths, preferences, needs, and interests. There are a number of assessments that you can use. In a handout that's used by the Northern Lights Cooperative, a special education cooperative in northeastern Minnesota, you will find hyperlinks to a multitude of assessments that can be used based on student availability and your preference. You can also make some of these interviews into Google Forms for parents and students to complete online. This can be helpful when you are not able to schedule time to do a face-to-face or a phone interview with a parent. I also find that some students prefer to write out answers, and then others prefer to do face-to-face. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to go ahead and pull up that link for you, show you some of the information that you can find here. And so this, again, shows you that reminder that we must, address that need for transition. And again, that 2 informal transition assessments may be completed. And so you'll find a plethora of information here regarding assessments for different levels of ability as well. And so in this one here, for example, it's pictures. And so you can have a student that you're working with go ahead and circle or cross out activities that they like to do, activities that they don't like to do. And then when we go back over to this assessment list, this is one that I tend to use quite a bit with my students here, is this interview form. It's called Planning for the Future. And we just, either I'll give it to the students or we kind of walk through it. I like to do this at the very beginning of the school year, whether or not it's time for their IEP or not. Just to kind of have that baseline data at the beginning of the year. But we'll talk about what kind of jobs they want to be doing right after high school. What type of chores do they do at home? What kinds of things do they enjoy doing at home and in their community? Where do they want to live after school? What does their recreation and leisure look like? What kind of activities do they enjoy? There's room for other there, and I like that this gives some ideas to students and then they start thinking on their own. And then down here it talks about transportation. And since I work mainly with 9th and 10th graders, getting a driver's license tends to be a big draw here. And then some of these services, some of them may be things that students don't use, maybe they are things that students do use. And so we can kind of go through them and we talk about what each of these might look like in our community, in our area. And then other things like physical examination and counseling. Are they receiving any services? Do they know when their last physical was? Again, this is helpful information when they are looking at trying to transfer that ability of their own to going out and scheduling their own appointments. So as you can see, there was plenty of information and resources out there to get that assessment data. All right. So you have the assessments, you have the information filled out. Now what? Once the assessments are completed, a summary of the data collected should be written. The case manager will review the present levels of performance for each of those 3 domains of the transition areas. Do you remember what those were? I'll help you out. There was employment, post-secondary education, and independent living. And independent living serves as a cover for, or houses, community participation, recreation and leisure, and home living. The present level of performance should indicate a student's current level of functioning and how their disability impacts this area of their transition, in addition to the impact of this disability on their abilities in the general education classroom. The present levels of the student's performance will serve as the foundation in creating the IEP. Once the team knows where the student is currently performing, they can determine the needs and build the goals from there. When the team creates goals at the IEP meeting, they can choose to create goals that address transition and academics in one goal, or separate needs in separate goals. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. But as you can see here, those performance levels, present levels of performance, are the foundation for that entire IEP. So once we know where the student is performing, we can then narrow it down into what the needs are, and then that helps us narrow it down to the goals, and that gives us what we need as far as services and accommodations. And what you're going to find in your packet handout that I've got for you is a document. You will find a document that follows that same format. And it starts out with that larger box up top showing you what are the present levels of performance. You record what your assessments were. What was the data that you collected? What did you get there? And then you'll see a smaller box. What are those needs of the student? Then it gets a little smaller. What is the goal that you think would be good based on this information? And who or what program can help with this goal? So as you're taking notes and reading through your assessments, this is a cheat sheet that you can use, a handout that you can use in order to kind of narrow it down for yourself. All right. So getting back to our slideshow here. What I've done next here is we've got a couple of examples of present level of performance statements. Now these are actual statements from individual education plans. And so this first one here we're going to look at, it deals with employment, and then the second one looks at community participation. So what will happen is you'll bring these present level of performance statements to your IEP meeting. Hopefully if you had a time or a chance to share them with some team members ahead of time. And now the team can discuss how to set goals around these two statements. Statement 1 states, the student completed the Casey Life Skills Assessment. In the area of work and study life, the student's self-assessment indicates that they do not know how to fill out a job application or create a resume. Overall, they demonstrated a need to learn about employment issues such as job preparation, job benefits, filing tax return forms, and understanding their pay stubs. And then the second one reads, while completing the student transition interview, students stated that they do not participate in many recreation activities with their peers, but they do attend functions with relatives. They attend various church activities, and the student enjoys communicating with adults more than their peers. Student needs to be able to communicate with same-aged peers in order to complete group work in classes in high school and in college. So it's recommended that the case manager come to the meeting with some suggestions for goals, just something to get the ball rolling. In addition, it's beneficial and recommended to discuss these with the student ahead of time as well. For example, I will review the student-based assessments with the student prior to the IEP meeting. I will ask the student ways they would like to use this information to set goals at their meeting. What do they feel they can do and what would they do to meet the goal? In the first example, I would look at the students' courses to determine if they have a general education class that might help fulfill this area. A careers course taught to 9th graders at our school covers a lot of these issues and will support the student in meeting this need. In the second example, the student indicates that they struggle to communicate with peers. We would problem solve by perhaps making a list of peers that they enjoy being around, identifying classes that that person or those people are in, and then brainstorm ways that they could communicate with that person. And then we would take that information to the team meeting and create a goal out of that. In doing this ahead of time, I have notes ready for the full team meeting, and the student knows that I can speak on their behalf if they get too flustered or embarrassed to speak in front of everybody. So I'm going to pull up one other example here of a present level of performance statement. So students will live with roommates after high school. So that is the student's independent living goal. Students' FastBridge test scores indicate that the student's score is at risk range for math. Student needs to increase their understanding of math number operations, specifically multiplication, addition, subtraction, and division, in order to live with roommates and successfully manage household expenses that they will share. So let's use that statement now to create a goal. So after our team has discussed why the student needs a goal around this, we've talked about budgeting, we've talked as a team about being able to split perhaps the internet bill or the rent, having to divide that up. Perhaps it's, figuring out a percentage with your roommates, that type of thing. The student the goal that we came up with was the student will improve their understanding of division, multiplication, adding, and subtracting by creating a monthly budget reflecting needed and necessary items, some optional and fun items for activities, and a savings set aside for desired items as measured by a work product. So our first objective that we're going to do with this student is going to give them an assignment, and the student will identify a desirable item. So perhaps it's something like a cell phone they want, or a bicycle, or some clothing. And they're going to determine the cost of the item, determine when they would like to purchase the item, calculate how much money they must save each week in order to make that purchase as measured by the work product. So by that assignment, we're going to go ahead and give them a product to save money for and figure out how long it's going to take them to save that money. And then our second objective would be, given their anticipated weekly income, students will create a budget reflecting needed and necessary items, some optional fun items or activities, and savings set aside for desired items for 4 weeks as measured by the work product. So in this example, we're not exactly saving up for anything specifically. We're just looking at what is it that you need as a budget as a whole to operate for 4 weeks at home and with your roommates. And so by doing so, they're going to be having to divide up their earnings, divide up their income, subtract each item as they use their pay stubs, calculate all that out. And so that's the goal, is ultimately to help them get more understanding of their multiplication, division, adding, and subtracting as a result of that real world application. So what else do you find in a transition IEP? Well, in the transition IEP, you also find that they list out the courses of study, the anticipated month and year of graduation, any transition services, and the age of majority. So beginning in the 9th grade, IEPs must list out current and projected courses of study for the student. You cannot just say, student will take math, English, and electives. It must state that student will take math, English, careers, industrial technology, mythology, resource transition class, such and so on. So any specific class that the student is taking, including their special education classes, must be broken down and listed on the form. And we're going to look at an example of that here in just a moment. In addition, the teams can also determine if any of these classes will be used to meet the needs of that needed credits for graduation. So is a resource transition class replacing a social studies elective credit that they would need for graduation? And this is a section that will update it at each IEP meeting. So perhaps a student has to retake a class, or perhaps they attempted to take a regular chemistry and they ended up needing to be in a modified chemistry. It's something that we modify and adjust as we go through the year. The anticipated month and year of graduation is just that. You put in the month and the year that the student is anticipated to graduate. Now in transition services, the case manager will list all the activities, including special education instruction, that have or might take place to help the student reach their post-secondary goals. In our previous example, we would categorize that math goal of better understanding number operations in order to create a budget as an instruction goal. And the age of majority is the age in which a student is transferred the right to the parental rights of the IEP, which is 18. So the discussion should begin once a student is 16. So once a student turns 16, you want to make sure that you're talking with the family, letting them know that once their student is 18, they can and have the right to sign off on their IEPs, sign that they understand and explain that. They even have the option to sign themselves out and not be in special education anymore. And so in speaking of that courses of study, here we have an example of a student who in grade 9, and there's this particular school year that they were in. This particular student took resource math, resource English, physical science, civics, art 1, choir, physical education, intro to industrial tech. And then in grade 2, the student took these additional classes. So biology, choir, entrepreneurship, resource English, resource math, high school STEM, small engines, U.S. history, ceramics, introduction to business, and welding. And then when their IEP would come due then for the next year, they would fill in grade 11 and then the classes and courses that the student would typically take in grade 11. And there you see is that anticipated month and year of graduation. Now, if the student in question here was taking something instead of or in lieu of a class, let's say instead of civics, they were taking a transitions class, we would make a note down here. There would be a box that would open up that says, student is taking this class in lieu of civics credit or in lieu of an elective credit in order to meet graduation requirements. And so when we talked about those transition services, here's where you not only see school staff listed, but service providers are also listed as those who have a responsibility to help students meet their goals for transition. In our previous example of a student who had the lack of career understanding, on this screen we would want to include that information here, that a specific class is being listed as responsible for meeting the student's needs. One thing to point out is that not all of these are necessarily IEP goals. These are more transition related and not necessarily addressing goals of the IEP. So as you see here, for example, the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives. These are some choices and activities that the student can take part of. And then it talks about what agency or who is providing that service. So for example, in our school, they have a mentoring day that all area community schools can take part in. And that's coordinated and set up by the special education case managers. They have a work-based learning programs and vocational rehabilitation services. And so the voc rehabilitation services come in and can have a conversation with the student and their family. Same thing here with the work-based learning program that's housed under the Northern Lights Special Education Cooperative. So then they can come in and talk to the student about that. And so these are just services that can get changed through, as students learn and receive these resources and services, they get updated and put in here as well. So these are all the services that the student has or will be receiving in order to get these supports. So you might find that maybe in 9th grade a student isn't ready to hear about voc rehab, but you put it on here, and then in the following year we can revisit it, update it as needed, and then make sure that we get those people in contact with the student. And down here you'll see that when the student, you'll let that student know and their family know when the rights of the parental rights will be transferred over to the student unless a guardian or conservator is appointed. And so once a student is 18, they again have that right to sign themselves out of special education or sign on their IEPs for themselves. So the IEP meeting itself. When holding the IEP meeting, allow the student to lead as much of the discussion as possible. When you pre-meet with the student, you can determine what they feel most comfortable speaking about with the group. The goal should be that over time, the student is leading the discussion more and more each year. In addition to the education team, the transition years is a time to include representatives from work-based learning, vocational rehabilitation, and other community-based career service program providers. These providers can share information about their program, and the team can ask questions as to how their services may assist the student in meeting their goals. So the team is really going to be focusing in on what things are needed to transition out of high school. What types of classes are they going to need? Looking at that class list of things that they've taken, looking at those interest forms that you've already had the parent and the student complete, teacher feedback that you've gotten, where the student's strengths are, what do the teachers see as far as strengths for students, all of that information and data you've gathered, just like you would for a regular IEP, you then can take that to this team. And, it might even be something as simple as, I'm going to let the students share what they have kind of completed as far as their survey. And some of them might not want to, some of them enjoy it. Some of it I find when adults start talking and then the student tends to shrink back, I try to make sure I draw them out and say, well, what do you think? And so making sure that we're including and empowering the students to advocate for themselves as much as possible. So in summary and conclusion here, what we really want to remember is that, an IEP is an opportunity for the student to really make this about them. We wanted to know what a transition IEP is And what it is, it's designed for the student planning for that post-secondary life. We wanted to know when and how to assess for transition IEPs. And this is done before or during the 9th grade. Transition goals are created by using assessments related to transition, career interest, hobbies, activities that they enjoy in their community. And we need to know how general education teachers and community providers play a role in that transition IEP. And both end up being a part of those transition goals or some of those continued transition services that go on outside of the goals. And understanding why a student has a transition IEP. A transition IEP is a great opportunity for students to set goals and think about their post-secondary options. There are numbers of resources out there, and it can be overwhelming. As case managers, I encourage you to find the tools that work best for you and your students. The most meaningful goals are those that the students and their families have a valued voice in. So take time in your meetings with them to hear what it is that they wish to see for their children's future and for their future. And make sure that you make those student-led as much as possible. Thank you.